The groom's ex gifted a Bible on their wedding day. What fell out during the reception shocked everyone. It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives, until the bride opened a gift and everything changed. 300 guests, a cathedral in Lagos decorated with white roses and gold accents, a couple that everyone said was perfect together. Then a Bible arrived, wrapped in silver paper, with a handwritten note that said, "May God bless your union." The bride smiled when she opened it during the reception, touched by what seemed like a gesture of forgiveness from her husband's ex-girlfriend. But when she lifted the Bible, something fell out. A photograph. And the moment it hit the floor, the entire hall went silent. Because in that photo, taken just 2 weeks before the wedding, her husband was with someone everyone in that room recognized. This isn't a story about jealousy. This is a story about secrets, about revenge carefully planned and perfectly timed, and about how one moment can unravel everything you thought you knew about the person you just promised to spend forever with. Who sent that Bible, and why that specific gift? Who took the photograph that fell out, and how did it end up in the bride's hands on the day she got married? Was this a last-minute act of heartbreak from a woman who couldn't let go? Or was it something much more calculated, something that had been planned for weeks or months, while wedding invitations were being sent and dresses were being fitted? And here's the question that haunted everyone who was there that day. Who was really being blessed in that moment? The couple getting married, or the person who knew their marriage was built on lies? Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Let me introduce you to the people at the center of this story, because understanding who they were makes what happened even more devastating. Chidinma Okafor was 29 years old, a marketing executive at a tech company in Lagos, the kind of woman who had her life planned out in 5-year increments. She was ambitious, organized, had a spreadsheet for her wedding budget, and a Pinterest board with over 2,000 pins. She'd been dreaming of her wedding day since she was a little girl watching her older sister get married. Ebuka Nwosu was 32, a businessman who owned a logistics company that had done well enough to afford him a nice apartment in Lekki, a Range Rover, and the kind of confidence that made people trust him instantly. He was charming in that effortless way, the guy who could walk into a room and within minutes have everyone laughing at his stories. His family adored him, his friends looked up to him, and Chidinma thought she'd won the lottery when he proposed after 18 months of dating. But there was someone else in this story. Someone whose presence hung over the wedding like a shadow, even though she wasn't supposed to be part of it anymore. Amaka Eze, Ebuka's ex-girlfriend, had dated him for 3 years before Chidinma ever appeared in his life. They'd met at university, stayed together through graduation, talked about marriage and children and growing old together. Amaka was quiet where Ebuka was loud, thoughtful where he was impulsive, deeply religious in a way that shaped everything she did. She carried a Bible everywhere, attended church 3 times a week, believed that love was a covenant blessed by God. When Ebuka broke up with her 6 months before meeting Chidinma, Amaka was devastated. He'd done it suddenly, over the phone, with an explanation that felt rehearsed. "I need to focus on my business. We want different things. You deserve someone better." She called him for weeks afterward, sent messages asking what had gone wrong, prayed for reconciliation. Then she stopped, deleted his number, unfollowed him on social media, told her friends she was moving on. To everyone who knew her, Amaka had handled the breakup with grace and dignity, the way she handled everything, with quiet strength and faith that God had a plan. When Ebuka started dating Chidinma and posted their relationship all over Instagram, Amaka didn't comment, didn't like any posts, didn't reach out. When the engagement photos went up 6 months later, Amaka's friends watched her carefully, expecting her to break down or say something bitter. But she just smiled and said she was happy for him, that she'd moved on, that she was focusing on her relationship with God. People believed her, because that's what you do when someone seems fine. You believe them, because it's easier than acknowledging that beneath the calm surface, something else might be building. The wedding was planned for a Saturday in April at the Cathedral Church of Christ in Lagos, followed by a reception at one of those expensive event centers in Victoria Island that cost more than most people's annual salary. Chidinma had been planning every detail for 6 months, from the flavor of the cake to the exact shade of gold for the napkins. She'd asked Ebuka repeatedly if there was anyone from his past she should be worried about, any ex-girlfriends who might cause drama. He'd laughed and said no, that he'd ended things cleanly with everyone, that the past was the past. He never mentioned Amaka by name. And when Chidinma found old photos of them together on his Facebook from years ago, he said it was just a college relationship that hadn't worked out, nothing serious. What Chidinma didn't know was that 3 weeks before the wedding, Ebuka had sent Amaka a message. It was late at night, the kind of time when people make decisions they regret in the morning. The message said he wanted to see her one more time before he got married, to apologize properly, to make sure there were no hard feelings. Amaka, who'd spent 6 months trying to forget him, who'd prayed every day for the strength to let go, made a decision that would change everything. She agreed to meet him. The meeting, 7-Eleven. 2 weeks before the wedding, Ebuka showed up at Amaka's apartment in Surulere on a Thursday evening. She'd moved there after their breakup, a small one-bedroom that was all she could afford on her salary as an administrator at a medical clinic. When she opened the door, seeing him standing there after 6 months felt like being hit in the chest. He looked the same, maybe a little more polished, wearing the kind of expensive watch she knew he couldn't afford when they were together. They sat in her living room, and for the first hour, it was almost like old times. They talked about work, about mutual friends, about his upcoming wedding in careful, surface-level ways that avoided the real emotions underneath. Then Ebuka did something that Amaka would replay in her mind 1,000 times afterward. He told her he'd made a mistake. Said that breaking up with her had been the biggest error of his life, that he'd done it because he was scared of commitment, that he'd started dating Chidinma on the rebound, and things had moved too fast. He said he thought about Amaka all the time, missed her in ways that made it hard to sleep at night. He said the wedding was in 2 weeks, and he didn't know if he could go through with it. Amaka sat on her couch, listening to this, her Bible on the coffee table between them, where it always was, and felt something break open inside her. 6 months of healing, of prayer, of convincing herself she was over him, all of it crumbling. She asked him what he wanted from her, why he'd come here to say these things when he was about to marry someone else. Ebuka moved closer, put his hand on her knee, and said he needed to know if there was any chance they could work things out, if she'd take him back if he called off the wedding. What happened next depends on who you ask. Amaka would later say that nothing happened, that she'd told him he needed to leave, that he'd made his choice and needed to live with it. But there was someone else there that night. Someone neither of them had invited. Someone who'd been watching the building and waiting for exactly this moment. Marcus Johnson, Ebuka's best friend since secondary school, the man who would stand beside him at the altar in 2 weeks as his best man. Marcus had been in love with Amaka for years. He'd met her when Ebuka first started dating her, and something about her quiet faith and gentle nature had drawn him in. He'd never said anything, never acted on it, because that was his best friend's girlfriend, and there were lines you didn't cross. But when Ebuka broke up with Amaka, Marcus had hoped. He'd started showing up at her church, sitting in the back row, finding reasons to run into her at the market or at mutual friends' gatherings. He'd been building up the courage to ask her out when Ebuka announced he was engaged to Chidinma. Marcus had felt betrayed, angry that his friend was moving on so easily while Amaka was still hurting. When Ebuka mentioned casually a few days before that he was thinking about visiting Amaka to clear the air before the wedding, Marcus knew exactly what that meant. He'd followed Ebuka that Thursday evening, parked down the street from Amaka's building, and waited. He brought his camera, a nice DSLR he used for his side photography business, telling himself he just wanted evidence in case Ebuka did something that would hurt Chidinma. But really, deep down, he wanted proof that Ebuka was still the same person who'd thrown away something precious and didn't deserve either woman's love. Around 9 in the evening, Marcus saw them through Amaka's living room window. The curtains weren't fully closed, and from his angle on the street he had a clear view. Ebuka and Amaka sitting close on the couch, his hand on her knee, her face turned up toward his. Marcus raised his camera and started shooting. He captured maybe 20 photos in the span of 5 minutes, different angles, different moments of intimacy that from a distance looked exactly like what you'd expect from a couple that was still in love. Then Ebuka left, got in his car, and drove away. Marcus waited another hour to make sure Ebuka was really gone before he approached Amaka's door. When she opened it, surprised to see him, he showed her the photos on his camera's display screen, told her he'd been worried about her, had followed Ebuka to make sure she was safe, had witnessed everything. Amaka looked at those photos and saw how they appeared, how anyone looking at them would interpret what they were seeing. She tried to explain that nothing had happened, that she'd sent Ebuka away, but Marcus was shaking his head. He said it didn't matter what actually happened, only what the photos showed. And what they showed was Ebuka with his ex-girlfriend 2 weeks before his wedding, in her apartment, in positions that looked intimate and wrong. Marcus asked Amaka a question that would set everything else in motion. Don't you think his bride deserves to know what kind of man she's marrying? Amaka should have said no. She should have deleted the photos, told Marcus to mind his own business, chosen the high road that her faith had always guided her toward. But she didn't. Because sitting there looking at those photos, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 6 months. Rage. Rage that Ebuka had broken her heart and moved on so easily while she'd spent months crying herself to sleep. Rage that he'd come to her apartment pretending to want closure, when really, he just wanted to feel better about himself. Rage that, in 2 weeks, he'd stand in a church and make vows while she sat at home alone trying not to think about it. Rage that he'd gotten away with hurting her without any consequences. So, when Marcus suggested they make sure Chidinma knew the truth, when he proposed a plan that was calculated and cruel and perfect, Amaka agreed. They would wait until the wedding day. They would let Ebuka think he'd gotten away with everything, let him stand at that altar and say his vows, let him believe his past was buried. And then, at the reception, when everyone was celebrating and toasting and taking photos, Chidinma would receive a gift. A Bible. Because that's what Amaka was known for. That's what people expected from her. Religious, forgiving, gracious, Amaka sending a blessing to her ex-boyfriend's wedding. Nobody would think twice about it. Inside the Bible, they would place one photo, the one that looked the most damaging. The one where Ebuka's hand was on Amaka's knee, and their faces were close enough that you couldn't tell if they were about to kiss or just talking. They would include a small note, handwritten in Amaka's careful script. May your marriage be built on the truth you've hidden. Proverbs 28:13. Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. Marcus handled the logistics. He had the photo printed professionally, good quality paper that looked expensive. He bought the Bible from a Christian bookstore, a nice leather-bound edition with gilded pages. He wrapped it himself in silver paper with a white ribbon, made it look like a legitimate gift. 3 days before the wedding, he delivered it to the event center with specific instructions that it should be given to the bride during the reception, not before, when she'd be relaxed and happy and surrounded by people. Amaka tried to back out twice. The night before the wedding, she called Marcus crying, saying this was wrong, that revenge wasn't what God wanted from her, that she should just let it go. But Marcus convinced her that this wasn't revenge. This was justice. Chidinma deserved to know who she was marrying. If she went through with the wedding knowing the truth, that was her choice. But at least it would be an informed choice. The morning of the wedding, Amaka stayed in her apartment with her phone turned off, praying for forgiveness for what she was about to do, and praying that somehow it would all work out the way it was supposed to. The wedding day. The wedding was beautiful, exactly what Chidinma had dreamed of. The cathedral was packed with family and friends, the decorations were perfect, the choir sang like angels. Ebuka stood at the altar in a black tuxedo looking nervous and excited, his best man Marcus beside him holding the rings. When Chidinma walked down the aisle in her dress that had cost 3 million naira, imported from South Africa with lace and crystals, and a train that required 4 flower girls to carry, everyone stood and applauded. Her father, who worked overtime for years to afford this day, had tears running down his face. Her mother was openly weeping in the front row. The ceremony went smoothly. The vows were spoken, the rings were exchanged, the pastor pronounced them husband and wife. When Ebuka kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in celebration. Outside the church, guests threw rice and took 1,000 photos while the couple smiled and waved. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as planned. The reception started at 4 in the afternoon at the Azure Event Center in Victoria Island. The ballroom was decorated in gold and white, with centerpieces of white roses and orchids on every table. There was a live band, a professional DJ for later, a buffet with every Nigerian delicacy you could imagine, and some international dishes for the guests who'd flown in from abroad. The champagne flowed, the speeches were heartfelt and funny, and Chidinma felt like she was floating through the happiest day of her life. Around 6 in the evening, after the first dance and the cake cutting and the toast from both fathers, the couple sat down at the head table to catch their breath and take in the celebration happening around them. That's when an usher approached with a stack of gifts that had been arriving throughout the day. Most were cards with money inside, the traditional way of giving wedding gifts in Nigeria. But one package stood out, wrapped more carefully than the others, with a card attached that Chidinma opened first. The card said, "Dear Chidinma and Ebuka, may God bless your union with the truth and light that guides all righteous marriages. May you build your home on a foundation that cannot be shaken, with prayers for your future, Amaka." Chidinma's first reaction was surprise, then a warm feeling that Ebuka's ex-girlfriend was gracious enough to send a blessing. She'd never met Amaka, had only heard Ebuka's brief description of her as someone I dated in school, but this gesture made her think well of her. She showed Ebuka the card, and his face went pale, but Chidinma was already unwrapping the gift and didn't notice. She lifted the Bible out of the silver paper, admiring the leather cover and gold-edged pages. Some of her bridesmaids had gathered around to see the gifts, and they oohed and awed appropriately. Chidinma opened the Bible, thinking she might find a highlighted verse or a personal inscription. Instead, a photograph fell out and fluttered to the table. For a moment, nobody moved. Chidinma picked up the photo with hands that weren't quite steady, looked at it for 5 seconds that felt like an hour, and then dropped it like it had burned her fingers. One of the bridesmaids gasped. Another picked up the photo before Chidinma could stop her, and her eyes went wide. Within seconds, the photo was being passed around the head table, and the whispers started spreading through the reception hall like wildfire. Chidinma sat frozen in her chair, her beautiful dress suddenly feeling too tight, the room suddenly too hot, while beside her, Ebuka was saying her name over and over, reaching for her hand, trying to explain something she couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears. The photo showed her husband, the man she'd just promised forever to, sitting on a couch with his arm around a woman Chidinma recognized from his old Facebook photos. His hand was on the woman's knee. Their faces were close together. The timestamp on the photo, visible in the corner from the camera's automatic settings, was from 14 days ago. 2 weeks before their wedding. While Chidinma was doing the final dress fitting, confirming the menu, addressing the last of the invitations, her fiancé had been at his ex-girlfriend's apartment in a position that looked intimate and wrong in ways that made Chidinma's stomach turn. If you're still watching to this point, comment "I'm still here" in the comments section. Let's see who's really following this story to the end, because what happens next is when everything truly fell apart. Chidinma stood up from the head table so abruptly that her chair fell backward. The band was still playing. Most guests hadn't noticed anything was wrong yet, but at the head table, chaos was erupting. Ebuka was on his feet trying to grab Chidinma's arm, saying, "It's not what it looks like, I can explain, let me explain." Chidinma pulled away from him and walked toward the exit, moving fast despite the heavy dress and heels. Her maid of honor and 2 bridesmaids ran after her, and that's when the rest of the reception realized something had happened. The music stopped. People turned to watch the bride leaving her own wedding reception with tears streaming down her face, mascara running, while the groom stood at the head table looking panicked and guilty. Someone, probably multiple someones, started recording on their phones. By the time Chidinma made it to the bridal preparation room and locked herself inside with her bridesmaids, videos were already being uploaded to Instagram and Twitter. The photo itself was being passed around the reception, photographed by dozens of people, sent via WhatsApp to friends who weren't even at the wedding. Within an hour, it would be on every Lagos gossip blog. Within 3 hours, it would be trending on Nigerian Twitter. Ebuka tried to follow Chidinma, but her brothers and uncles blocked him. And there was a tense moment where it looked like the wedding might end with the groom getting beaten up by the bride's family. Marcus, the best man, pulled Ebuka aside and convinced him to give Chidinma space, to let her calm down, to wait until they could talk privately. Ebuka was crying now, saying over and over that he hadn't cheated, that he'd just gone to apologize to his ex, that nothing had happened. Marcus listened and nodded and said all the right supportive things, while inside he felt a satisfaction so intense it was almost scary. The reception continued in the strangest way. The older guests who hadn't seen the photo yet kept eating and drinking, confused about why the bride had left. The younger guests were huddled in groups looking at their phones, showing each other the evidence, debating whether Ebuka had cheated or not. Some people left early, uncomfortable with the drama. Others stayed to see what would happen next, treating it like entertainment. Chidinma's parents were devastated. Her father, who'd spent money he couldn't really afford on this wedding, sat in a chair with his head in his hands. Her mother was with Chidinma in the preparation room, trying to convince her to come back out, saying they could figure this out later, that leaving would make the scandal worse. But Chidinma refused. She took off her wedding dress right there, put on jeans and a t-shirt someone brought from her car, and demanded her father take her home. She left through a back exit of the event center, without speaking to her husband, without making any announcement, without giving anyone closure. She just disappeared, leaving 300 confused guests and a groom who'd been married for less than 4 hours and was already losing his wife. The next morning, when the shock had worn off enough for people to think clearly, the investigations began. Chidinma's brothers demanded to know who had sent the Bible, who had taken the photo, whether Ebuka had actually cheated, or whether this was someone trying to ruin the wedding. The card had Amaka's name on it, so they tracked her down through mutual friends and showed up at her apartment, demanding answers. Amaka, who hadn't slept all night, who'd been sick with guilt and fear since Marcus texted her that the plan had worked, opened her door to find 4 angry men asking if she'd sent the gift. She said yes, she'd sent a Bible as a blessing, but she didn't know about any photo. The men didn't believe her. They pushed their way into her apartment, looking for evidence, looking for more copies of the photo, looking for anything that would prove she'd sabotaged the wedding. Amaka called the police, and the situation escalated into something that made the local news. Meanwhile, Ebuka was dealing with his own interrogation from Chidinma's family. They wanted to know everything: where he'd been 2 weeks ago, why he'd gone to his ex-girlfriend's apartment, what had actually happened that night, whether he'd cheated, whether there had been other times, whether anything about their relationship had been real. Ebuka swore he hadn't cheated, that he just wanted closure before the wedding, that he and Amaka had talked and nothing physical had happened. He claimed the photo was misleading, taken at an angle that made an innocent conversation look like something else. Chidinma's family didn't know whether to believe him. Chidinma herself wasn't answering his calls, had blocked him on all social media, had moved back into her parents' house, and refused to see him. 3 days after the wedding, a journalist from a popular Lagos blog got involved. She'd seen the story trending on social media and smelled a bigger narrative. She tracked down everyone involved: Chidinma, Ebuka, Amaka, even Marcus. She interviewed guests who'd been at the wedding, looked at the video footage that people had posted online, examined the photo closely. What she discovered was that the photo's metadata told a story nobody had considered. The photo had been taken from outside Amaka's apartment, through a window, using a professional camera. It wasn't a selfie, wasn't taken by Amaka or Ebuka. Someone else had taken it, someone who'd been watching them. When the journalist published her findings, the story exploded in a new direction. If neither Amaka nor Ibuka had taken the photo, who had? And why had they waited until the wedding day to reveal it? That's when Marcus's name started coming up. Some of Ibuka's friends mentioned that Marcus had been acting strange before the wedding, that he'd asked a lot of questions about Amaka, that he'd seemed almost excited when Ibuka mentioned visiting her. Chidinma's maid of honor remembered that Marcus had been the one who'd coordinated with the event center about gift deliveries, that he'd specifically arranged for the Bible to be given to the bride during the reception. The pieces started connecting in ways that told a different story than anyone had imagined. 6 days after the wedding, Marcus was confronted by Ibuka and two of their mutual friends at a bar in Ikeja. They'd put together enough information to understand what he'd done, and they wanted answers. Marcus, who'd been living with the secret for a week and was starting to crack under the weight of it, confessed everything. He told them about following Ibuka to Amaka's apartment, about taking the photos, about approaching Amaka afterward and convincing her to go along with his plan. He explained that he'd done it because Ibuka didn't deserve either woman, because someone needed to stop him from building a marriage on lies. Ibuka lunged across the table and would have hit Marcus if their friends hadn't held him back. There was shouting, accusations, years of friendship disintegrating in minutes. Marcus said things he'd kept buried for years about being tired of watching Ibuka use people and get away with it, about being in love with Amaka himself and seeing her get hurt. Ibuka said things back about betrayal and jealousy, and Marcus being a pathetic hanger-on who'd always lived in his shadow. The confrontation ended with their friendship destroyed and Marcus leaving Lagos entirely, moving to Abuja where he had family, trying to escape the consequences of what he'd set in motion. But the damage was done, and it kept spreading. When Chidinma learned that Marcus had orchestrated the whole thing, that the photo had been real but the context had been manipulated, that Ibuka genuinely hadn't cheated but had made the stupid decision to visit his ex right before the wedding, she didn't know what to feel. Part of her was relieved that her husband hadn't betrayed her sexually. Part of her was furious that he'd lied about seeing Amaka at all. Part of her felt manipulated by Marcus, who'd used her wedding day as a weapon in his own vendetta. And part of her just felt exhausted by the whole thing, by the public scandal, by the questions from everyone she knew, by the reality that her marriage had been poisoned before it even began. She met with Ibuka 4 weeks after the wedding at a neutral location, a cafe in Lekki where they'd had their first date. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept since the wedding, and immediately started apologizing. He admitted he shouldn't have gone to see Amaka, that it was stupid and disrespectful, that he should have been honest about it instead of hiding it. He swore again that nothing physical had happened, that he'd realized during that conversation with Amaka that he wanted to be with Chidinma, that visiting his ex had actually given him the closure he needed. He begged for a chance to prove himself, to rebuild the trust he'd damaged, to start their marriage properly. Chidinma listened to all of this and then asked him a question that got to the heart of everything. If Marcus hadn't taken that photo, if I'd never found out about you going to see her, would you have told me? Ibuka was quiet for a long time before admitting no, he probably wouldn't have. Because he thought it didn't matter since nothing had happened. That answer told Chidinma everything she needed to know about whether their marriage could survive. Meanwhile, Amaka was dealing with her own fallout. Once her role in the plan became public knowledge, her reputation in the Christian community she'd been part of for years was destroyed. People called her vindictive, said she'd used God's word as a weapon, accused her of being unable to move on from a relationship that had ended months ago. Her church leadership called her in for a meeting about her behavior, and she'd ended up leaving that church entirely, too ashamed to face people who'd looked up to her faith. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd sent a Bible with a verse about concealing sins, and now her own sins were exposed for everyone to judge. She tried to reach out to Chidinma to apologize, to explain that she'd been hurt and angry and had made a terrible decision. But Chidinma blocked her number, wanted nothing to do with the woman who'd helped ruin her wedding day. Amaka understood. She'd probably do the same thing in Chidinma's position. What Amaka couldn't undo was the public nature of the scandal. The story had been shared thousands of times online, had been discussed on radio shows and YouTube channels, had become one of those cautionary tales people told about wedding drama. Everyone in Lagos seemed to have an opinion about who was wrong and who was right, about whether Ibuka deserved forgiveness, about whether Amaka was a victim or a villain, about whether Marcus was a hero for exposing the truth or a snake for betraying his best friend. The consensus seemed to be that everyone involved had made mistakes, that there were no clear good guys or bad guys, just flawed people making messy decisions that hurt each other. 6 months after the wedding, more truths emerged that changed how people viewed the story. A woman came forward, claiming she dated Ibuka 2 years earlier, and that he'd cheated on her multiple times before she finally broke up with him. Another ex-girlfriend said Ibuka had proposed to her and then ghosted her when she started asking questions about his finances. A pattern emerged of Ibuka being charming and attentive at the beginning of relationships, then becoming evasive and dishonest as women got closer to him. These revelations made some people think Marcus had actually done Chidinma a favor by exposing Ebuka's character, even if the method was wrong. But others argued that Marcus's motivations were pure, that he'd acted out of jealousy and his own interest in Amaka rather than genuine concern for Chidinma, which made his actions manipulative rather than heroic. What nobody could argue was that the Bible gift had accomplished something, even if it wasn't what anyone intended. It had revealed truth, just not in the way the verse Amaka chose had meant. It had exposed not just Ebuka's lie about seeing his ex, but the deeper dysfunction in their relationship, his tendency to hide things, Chidinma's willingness to ignore red flags because she wanted the perfect wedding, the way both of them had prioritized the appearance of happiness over honest communication. In that sense, maybe the gift had been a blessing after all, a painful one that prevented them from building a marriage on a cracked foundation. The resolution. Chidinma and Ebuka's marriage lasted 8 months. They tried to make it work, went to counseling, attempted to rebuild trust, but the wedding day kept hanging over them like a ghost. And every argument somehow circled back to that moment when the photo fell out of the Bible and everything changed. The public nature of the scandal made it worse because everywhere they went, people recognized them, whispered about them, asked inappropriate questions about whether they were still together. In December, 8 months after that April wedding, Chidinma filed for divorce. The process was quiet, handled privately, without the drama that had surrounded their wedding. When people asked her why, she said simply that they'd realized they weren't right for each other, that the circumstances of how their marriage started had made it impossible to build something healthy. The truth, which she told only her closest friends, was that she could never fully trust Ebuka again. Not because of what he'd done with Amaka, which genuinely seemed to have been innocent, but because of the lying and the pattern of dishonesty that kept revealing itself. She couldn't spend her life wondering what else he wasn't telling her, couldn't build a future with someone who thought hiding things was acceptable as long as he didn't get caught. Ebuka took the divorce hard. He moved back in with his parents in Enugu, closed down his logistics business that had been struggling anyway, and basically disappeared from Lagos social life for over a year. Some people who ran into him later said he seemed different, humbled in a way he'd never been before. Like the experience had finally forced him to confront parts of himself he'd been avoiding. Whether that change was real or permanent, nobody could say. Amaka's story took a different turn. 3 months after the wedding scandal, she met someone new at a different church she'd started attending. A man named David who was divorced himself, who understood what it meant to carry regret for past mistakes, who didn't judge her for what she'd done because he'd made his own fair share of bad decisions. They started dating slowly, carefully, with an honesty that Amaka had never quite managed in her relationship with Ebuka. A year after the wedding scandal, Amaka and David got engaged. When people asked if she was planning a big wedding, she laughed and said no, they were going to do something small and private, just immediate family. She'd had enough of wedding drama to last a lifetime. She still carried guilt about what she'd done to Chidinma, still prayed for forgiveness, but she'd also come to understand that her anger at Ebuka had been valid, even if her method of expressing it had been wrong. She'd learned that faith didn't mean being passive when hurt, but it did mean responding to hurt in ways that didn't destroy other people in the process. It was a lesson she wished she'd learned before that April, before she'd let Marcus convince her that revenge could somehow be righteous. Marcus never returned to Lagos. He built a new life in Abuja, started a photography studio, avoided the mutual friends he'd had with Ebuka. The guilt he felt about destroying a marriage, even one that probably shouldn't have happened, was something he carried alone. He thought he was helping, thought he was exposing a lie that needed to be exposed, but looking back he could see his own motivations had been selfish. He'd wanted Amaka for himself, wanted Ebuka to fail, wanted to be the hero of a story where maybe he was actually the villain. He never spoke publicly about what happened, never tried to justify his actions, just lived with the knowledge that he'd hurt people who trusted him, and there was no taking that back. The wedding venue, Azure Events Center, saw a strange aftermath to the scandal. For about 6 months, they had fewer bookings as superstitious couples avoided the place where such dramatic disaster had struck. But then the opposite happened. Some couples specifically wanted to book there because of the story, as if surviving a wedding at the same venue would somehow protect their marriage or make it stronger. The event center never commented publicly on what happened, just quietly updated their gift protocol to screen packages more carefully before presenting them to couples. 2 years after the wedding, Chidinma had moved on in ways that surprised even her. She'd left her marketing job and started a business consulting practice, had moved to a new apartment in a different part of Lagos, had cut her hair short and joined a gym, and generally rebuilt herself into a version that felt stronger than before. She dated occasionally, but wasn't in a hurry to get married again, had learned that being alone was better than being with the wrong person. When people recognized her and brought up the wedding story, she no longer flinched. She'd smile politely, say that was another lifetime, and move on, stronger, lighter, free. But it leaves us with questions worth thinking about. Is love still love if it's built on half-truths? Does exposing the truth make you a hero or a villain if it destroys others in the process? And when forgiveness comes, who truly deserves it? The one who lied or the one who exposed the lie? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you made it this far, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life stories that remind us, sometimes, the truth doesn't set you free. It just shows you who you really are.